Well, this is really exciting to be back together again, and appreciate you all coming. Friday Forums, as we have done for the number of years, it's just been a really great time to get to know a whole lot of folks, and just fun to learn together, and so glad you are here. Love to introduce Tanya. She will be talking, and she has presented previously, and love to hear her talk. She's been with us a little over 12 years now in the clinic, and in this past season transition, I was one of the original founders and owners of the clinic, but in looking for moving forward, Tanya's agreed to take over the leadership of the clinic. And so grateful for her. She's got a lot of creativity and a lot of energy, and is bringing really good things to us as a clinic, including getting Friday Forums going again. So very pleased to have you here with us, Tanya. She does a lot of work with a lot of different kinds of people, and sometimes people can actually get into her schedule because she stays very full, and I know that you're going to experience some of that quality and competence as she talks with us here today. And so I'd like to begin with a word of prayer, and then turn it over to Tanya. Father, thank you for this time that we can be together, a time to learn about each other and talk with each other and grow together, but then a time to learn and grow as we explore this topic of ambiguous loss, something that is so common for so many people, and we're experiencing a lot of it now with what we've been through. And so I pray that you will really bless Tanya as she shares her knowledge with all of us here today, so that we can learn and take this with us. And we thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Oh, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I will let you know I am a little nervous being back, and my nose does run, so please excuse me. With that, when I get nervous, my nose starts to run, so my apologies, you guys. In such a season as this, we ever thought a runny nose would be so much anxiety producing, right? As I was preparing for this talk, I have given this talk probably about 5 years ago, which I can't even believe it's been 5 years have passed. And as I was reviewing my slides and my old notes, I realized how much loss has occurred in the last 2 years since I've originally started talking about ambiguous loss. And with that, I realize a lot of this work, we are fresh into loss. And sometimes a lot of this work is done, when there has been time and space away from our losses. And so I thought about just the sensitivity. I don't think there's anybody in this room that has not experienced at some level profound loss the last 2 years, or even have worked with people or sat with people that are continually goes through so much loss day to day. Even if it's not a clear, ordinary loss, such as a death, but just little losses that we lose day to day, such as just our sense of certainty and predictability. So I just want you to know that as I speak today, I really hold the both and that whatever the issues we have been facing in our world today, 360 degrees around, universally and collectively, we've experienced loss together. And we've been in the ambivalence of it, and we've been in the ambiguity of it. And that we all share together. And so I hope I can really speak to all of you today in regards to that in a very sensitive way as well. So, with that, I'm honored from Tom and both Carol. She's a previous owner and founder of Art Woods. Art Woods has been a clinic in our community for 32 years and has served the community very well in the mental services. And I really do feel honored in taking over that responsibility and moving our clinic into the next chapter. And we know that there's such a demand for mental health services ever before, and even for younger children and adolescents. This pandemic has generated a demand, and we are working very hard at trying to fulfill that demand, so we just want everybody to know that. And I'm sure all of you have felt the demand of need and services out there as well. With that, as I talk, I probably have more information here than what we can cover in our time. And I am very open to questions at any time and disruptions. I think I do better in dialogue than just coming up here and presenting the topic. And so, with that, how many of you have heard of Ambiguous Loss by Pauline Boss? Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. So that's good. So we kind of know what we're talking about or beginning to talk about, and I'm hoping that I can expand a little bit more on the topic for you today. So let me tell you a little bit about Pauline Boss. She was emeritus professor and clinical supervisor in marriage and family therapy at the University of Minnesota. She is kind of the founder of the language and theory and the research on ambiguous loss. And she has done a lot of work with the Red Cross, the tsunami, 9/11, all of these major catastrophes that we probably have experienced in the last 50 years. She has been a part of that relief effort in helping people through their loss and through their grief. And so she has a lot of experience, and she's written a wonderful book, which is a resource on the back of your outline. She is now in her late 80s, and she wrote a book, The Myth of Closure. That's her newest book, and loss in a time of change in our pandemic. And while she was writing the book, she lost her husband to death. He had a major stroke, and if anybody knows Dudley Riggs, who was a comedian here in Minnesota, a famous comedian, they were married for 30 years, and as she was writing this book, he had a major stroke and passed away. And so the book is just very touching because it's less clinical and more about her long time experience of working with people in loss and grief as well as her own. And so that's what I really enjoyed with her book today. One of the things that I have loved about her work and appreciated and admired about her work is that she has provided a language around loss that is just not the language we know from ordinary loss and clear loss such as death. She has brought a language that I feel provides space for people to really talk about and match that is congruent to their lived experience when there is losses or a loss that is unclear, where there's no verification of death or no ending. It's just kind of ongoing. And I have incorporated her work in my practice, and I have found that using her language and just speaking it and naming it for people gives them space to identify what they are going through and the stress that ambiguity brings for us, and it empowers them in a way that gives them some resiliency to endure their circumstances. So, as we all know, because we are living and we're human, loss is inevitable. And therefore, change is inevitable. And 2 years ago, we were thrown into a change, whether we wanted it or not. And with all change, there is a level of loss, even if it's positive change. Because change always brings about or requires us to adapt and transition. And for change means something different for everybody. It can be both positive and or negative, such as birth, life, death, health, illness, pregnancy, a missing person, or even a pandemic. And even as we think about the changes we've experienced the last 2 years, that there are negative parts to this as well as there's been positive parts. And they both have equal value. There are a lot of families that I sit with, and a lot of them, it forced them to actually slow down and spend more time together. But in the next hour, I could go online with another client, and it was the opposite. Spending more time together created a lot of negativity, a lot of distress, and a lot of loss there. So it's definitely a both and sort of thing. Got too much flipping here. Change is stressful and sometimes traumatic. And change invites and/or forces us into transition. As I said before, change is inevitable in life and life transitions. So even as we go through developmental stages of our life, we have to transition and something changes. And when we move into that change, we experience some level of loss. Even when I work with trauma survivors, that even as they find inner freedom and healing in the healing process, something is changing inside of them. And as they change through that, something is lost, or a previous way in how they experience themselves or even how they identify themselves is a loss for them, and they're moving into something new. And for some people, in that moment of realizing I'm no longer who I used to be, even if I'm moving in a positive direction, I still experience a grief and a loss. When we have loss and change, it requires us to transition. And sometimes when we move into that change, we experience a level of ambiguity. Even as though as we're moving into motherhood and we have a child, we're moving into a state of ambiguity because it's unknown. We don't know for sure what it's going to be like, and will I have the sense of agency to master what I need to master to be well enough in motherhood. So even if it's a positive thing or a negative thing that we're moving into that change, there's always a level of ambiguity that we're up against, a level of unknown, because we're entering into the unfamiliar. And with that, people always don't know. The stress is, will I have the capacity within to meet the demands of my environment? Will I have the mastery and power to actually transition into change? So, where there is loss, there's also the experience of grief. And I think what makes this stressful is that humans operate out of memory. How you got up this morning, how you got here this morning, even brushing your teeth, all operates out of some form of memory within us. So we rely so much on how we have learned in the past. Now, your conscious mind doesn't really have to think about how do I brush my teeth. There's a procedural memory learning that is already within us. Now, there's a little memory that happens, in getting here. We rely on our cell phones, right, our navigation, all right, where we're paying attention a little bit more. But if we've never been here before, then there's a little bit more stress that happens inside of us to make sure, am I going to get to the right place, and am I going to get there in time? Even coming in today, who's going to be here? What is it going to be like? Is it going to be safe? Now, when you think about it, our sense of safety has changed so much since this pandemic has begun. And we're entering in, more so now than ever before, our conscious mind is far more aware of the uncertainty that we live. Even coming in before the pandemic, we probably would experience a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of unknown, and maybe a little bit of stress, even though it might be a good kind of stress, but a little bit of anxiety of what is it going to be like, who's going to be there, what's the speaker going to be like, what is he or she going to say, am I going to be able to understand, am I going to be able to engage, all those things. And so it's how we show up. All of that is that internal stress of, can I meet the demands of the unknown? And so the ambiguity and not knowing for sure if we have the power and agency to meet whatever is needed in that unknown creates the stress. Does that make sense? And so another part, and a part of this is what keeps us stuck in transition. When I think about when this pandemic first started, we had a transition more into worlds that were much smaller. Our movement was much smaller day to day, and the people we got to be around with was less and less. And for that, it was unfamiliar. We all had a transition into something, and there was a lot of unknown, including the lack of factual information. If anything, our factual information has been so fluid across the board. And with that, it adds to the stress. It intensifies the uncertainty. And as that intensifies the uncertainty, for us internally, see, we're meaning-making creatures. How we operate is we're constantly trying to comprehend the things that are happening outside of us and happening inside of us and trying to create meaning. And if there's too much unknown, if there's too much lack of information or too much fluid information, then what that does, it creates a stress, and then it ignites our autonomic system, which is our fight-flee response, and we don't feel safe. If we don't feel safe in our environment, internally or externally, it's very hard for us to show up and engage and learn and connect and attune with other people. Our wiring just goes offline for that because we go more into survival mode. And I think all of us have experienced that survival mode at some point the last 2 years, or the people we've talked with really go into a survival mode because that's all we can do, right? We just gotta go day to day, minute by minute. And as we reflect back, what we lost was a sense of predictability. We lost a sense of certainty in our lives. So the things that keep us paralyzed is the stress that is caused by the unknown, the stress of not having the power and agency to really endure the stress. A lot of us were limited on those coping mechanisms that we utilize to help us manage stress day to day. But a lot of those got shifted. And so for a lot of us, when we're in survival mode, the part of our brain that is responsible for creativity goes offline. And so people became more limited of how they could adapt and change to different coping mechanisms to meet the demands or the stress of their environments that they were enduring. Oh, and I forgot another thing that keeps us stuck is ambivalence. Ambivalent emotions, when you have two emotions that contradict one another, that creates more confusion for people. And when that creates more confusion for people, they don't know what to trust. And then if they don't know what to trust, they become more anxious. And in that anxiety, people are more prone to become more hyper-aroused or shut down. That makes sense. I think there was a period of time I noticed that in the beginning, there was so much, people were so hyper-aroused, so anxious, really like intense, and then all of a sudden there was just this shutdown. And people were almost like zombies, the empty shells on autopilot. And you could just feel just the fluctuations that people were going through just because of all the ambiguity. Does anybody have any questions so far? Am I making sense? Oh, good. Now I feel better. I think too, I wanna talk about a real thing that I'd like to just keep out in the open here, in regards to the pandemic, and that is about ambiguity. That as the pandemic sickened and killed more people each day, and more people got sick over time, the uncertainty grew. So ambiguity isn't just this thing that just happened once. I want you to think of ambiguity on a continuum. And as that ambiguity intensified over time, what we all suffered collectively, our ultimate loss that we suffered, was the loss of trust in the world as a safe and predictable place, which is the crucible for high anxiety and distress. So I think that's something that no matter where somebody is in the process of what is going on, that the thing we do share together is that loss of trust in the world as a safe and predictable place. And as I said before, human beings operate out of predictability. We like certainty, okay? Because it gives us a sense of safety. And when we feel safe in our environments, then we can engage and relate with one another and attune and connect. So, what is ambiguous loss? Ambiguous loss is a loss that remains unclear and thus has no closure, which can be both physical and or psychological loss. Pauline Boss states that absence and presence are not absolutes. Even without death, the people we care about disappear physically or fade away psychologically, such as somebody with Alzheimer's, the brain injured, the stroke victim, as well as the kidnapped and or imprisoned, are all out of reach. The ambiguity between absence and presence creates a unique kind of loss that has both psychological and physical qualities. So the absence and presence that coexist and what lies between creates the most unique kind of loss that has both the psychological and physical qualities. So it is the stress of the both and. Like, for instance, the person with Alzheimer's. If you have a loved one with Alzheimer's, they're here and they're not here at the same time. So every time you go and you visit that person, they might not be the same. And they're physically present, but they are psychologically absent. And in that moment, it's not your mother or your father you once knew or you once had. And in that moment, you experience ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss, it's the ambiguity, again, it's the unknown that leads to a disenfranchised grief because others do not see the loss as credible or worthy of grief. And this is one of the things that I want you guys to think about that I have noticed in listening to many people the last 2 years. And that is that whatever the fill in the blank is in regards to how we define our loss, what I have found, because we are so distressed and under so much pressure and more in our survival mode, is that people started to place value on whose loss was more important than the others. And that is where we started to disconnect from one another. And we forgot about the universal connection we do have, and that is we all share in the pain of loss. And we all share in the anxiety of uncertainty. And so one of the things that I had to learn quite quickly as a clinician, that my loss, even in my own ideology of that loss, or even in my own meaning of that loss, or however I experienced ambiguous loss, did not have more value than the person I was sitting with that was probably experiencing the opposite sort of loss than me. And I had to learn to value and connect with that person more in the pain of loss and let go of the subject of what we attach to that loss. Does that make sense? And I think I learned that quite quickly. I stumbled upon it because I started to realize that it impacted how I held the space for people in their grief and in their anxiety and in their anger and in their sadness and everything in between. And so I had to really learn to hold that space. And in holding that space, I had to pay attention to how I was processing my own ambiguous loss and what meaning I attached to that.
That's an excellent point.
Yes.
I just want to say that's an excellent point with the idea of learning to hold space.
Yeah.
For people who value
Yes.
how hard that is when everybody's feeling so distressed, us included, as we
Right.
deal with kind of the adjustments in our own belief system, value system.
Yes, thank you. Because when you think about it, you know, our values are, and we have expectations to those values, right? And it's when life doesn't happen to fulfill those expectations, we lose something. So, yeah.
And I think, being able to help other people learn to do that.
Yes.
As we can sit with them in their own distress, but eventually maybe move them into, they're not just a victim, they're a participant, we're all participants.
Yes.
And when we start looking at the way that we participate, and how do we help move them from kind of being victimized by powerlessness they're feeling and the anger and bitterness, focusing it on change outside of them,
Right.
and change inside of them.
Right.
And, being able to hold both hands, that I can value, I can value your experience of the space for
Right.
you, even if it's different than mine.
I agree with you. Thank you for sharing that. It's true. And a lot of that inability to hold that space for someone who's experiencing a different loss than you in the same place, in the same family system, when we're under stress, remember the ambiguity is the stressor, okay? And when we're under stress, lower parts of our brain kicks in and it becomes very either or. And I think this is where the phenomenon of how we place value on other people's loss or our own loss created that gap. And so, and a lot of that just came out of survival and survival parts of our brain. So I understand how we got there. The next piece is to be able to identify it and be able to see it and be able to see it within ourselves. The division within ourselves, the fear around our own loss, because fear is the culprit. Fear is the divider of that, and it debilitates us from being able to hold the both and. My loss and the other loss, even though they are different or on opposite ends of the spectrum. Thanks, Terry, for sharing that.
Could you explain what you mean by opposite?
Meaning, if I've interpreted my loss here in regards to my loss of day-to-day life, and it's hard for me, and someone on the other end has not experienced, maybe in the same family, has not experienced that sort of loss in day-to-day life, what happens is that then we start to compare our loss of which one is the right one and which one is the wrong one. And what we do is we get more on the topic and the subject of that loss as opposed to being together and lost together, even though we define it differently or experience it differently. Did I answer your question? Ambiguous loss differs from ordinary loss because there's no verification of death, such as a missing loved one, no body. It could be an explosion or missing in action in 9/11. There were a multitude of people that never got that verification of death, as well as there's no certainty that the person will return the same way they used to be. So when there's been a traumatic brain injury or dementia or a stroke, anything like that, there's always the unknown of will this person return as we once knew them. And so the uncertainty and no verification of death, as well as no immediate resolution, keeps us in a state of ambiguity and keeps us in a state of loss, such as the pandemic. The thing that we lost in this pandemic is the certainty in life and predictability. And that in itself created a loss for us because we relied on it. I don't know about you, but even in the simplest thing as, getting something done around my house, nothing goes easy anymore. I mean, my newest saying now is, let's just expect the unexpected. Because we're up against so much fluidity and so much uncertainty that we'll try to create certainty in our life because we like it. It makes us feel safe. It's familiar, okay? But then we get caught into when things don't go the way we plan them to go or the way we predicted, then it throws us off and it creates more stress and we get very discombobulated and then it's hard for us to find our footing. The other ambiguous loss, I think, in this pandemic is that there's really no certainty that life will return the way it used to be. We don't know. We don't know what it's going to be like or what really has changed. And for that, it leaves us in a more destructive stress because when we're under stress, people need to know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Because if there's a light at the end of the tunnel, I can endure this stress and I can get there and I know a relief is going to come. So, with ambiguous loss, in the absence of evidence, definitive answers, and finality, the loss and thus its grief continues indefinitely, creating the most difficult stress for loved ones. Often the stress and pain created by ambiguity becomes traumatizing for loved ones, which paralyzes their ability to cope. So, the best way, has everybody seen 50 First Dates? You haven't? Oh, we gotta watch it. It's about someone who loses their memory and they wake up every day reliving their day as though they've never known it before, okay? Ambiguous loss is somewhat like that, but it's like 51st funerals. Every day in ambiguous loss, there is this intensity or state of grief that someone stays in because there's no end. So it is an ongoing loss that they are in, and that ongoing loss, when they don't know when it's going to end or if there's like a finality to it, then what happens is that stress of being stuck in it, as though this constant state of grief, is what paralyzes them. Again, oftentimes what happens is when we view that, this is why I think the language is so important, is that when people are stuck, they're stuck because of the uncertainty, not because there's something wrong with them. And we live in a culture where we definitely have a death-phobic culture. At least we did going into the pandemic. I know we did. And we also have a pain-phobic culture because we came out of an endemic of people addicted to painkillers. We don't like pain. We don't like psychological pain, emotional pain, physical pain, and spiritual pain. So this is why I think it's very hard for us to do loss. And this is really hard for us. This is why I think we pathologize it too, is because we want to fix it. We want to get that person out of that pain or discomfort. And when we can move them out of that pain and discomfort, then we feel more comfortable and we feel like they can function and go on. However, with ambiguous loss, and even with ordinary loss, we really don't go on. We move on, but there's really no such thing as closure. Because even if we lost physical loved ones, we carry them with us day to day, even if our lives are moving on. Does that make sense? So oftentimes when people are stuck, we pathologize it and see, well, you're struggling with anxiety, you're struggling with depression, and not that that's not true, but really they're struggling with those symptoms because it's probably congruent with what they are going through. And that is that state of uncertainty. So there are two types of ambiguous loss. There's the leaving without a goodbye, which is type 1, which is a physical absence with a psychological presence. No body to bury, no proof of death. Loss is very physical. The catastrophic forms of ambiguous loss are those who are disappeared, kidnapped, missing in action, natural disasters, dead people who have lost loved ones from COVID-19, where their families were not allowed to view their body after death. A lot of bodies were cremated right away, so families never really got to see the body and see that body in that death state. More common ambiguous losses are those who are going into a nursing home. And that's ironic, even people in a nursing home who cannot see their loved ones the last 2 years creates that ambiguous loss. Separations, divorces, adoptions, migration and immigration, military deployment, foster care, and gender transitioning are some of the common ambiguous losses. Again, the pandemic loss would be being with loved ones as they were dying, being able to have a funeral rituals of mourning and burial, jobs losses, and now ghosting. Does everybody know what ghosting is? Okay. I thought that...
No's.
Huh?
I see some no's on the ghosting, so
Yeah.
what's the definition?
Well, it's when someone is in your life and then they completely cut you off without even letting you know why they cut you off.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. All right. I learned that new too. Type 2 ambiguous loss is goodbye without leaving, and that is with a physical presence with a psychological absence. Here they're in body but gone in mind, so the loss is more psychological. The more catastrophic ambiguous losses in type 2 are Alzheimer's disease, dementia, brain injury, autism, chronic mental illness, addiction, depression, physical illness that takes memory and emotional expression. Common ones are the preoccupation with work and homesickness, preoccupation with social media and cell phone, video games, affairs, and pornography. Another part of the pandemic ambiguous loss that created here in the physical presence but psychological absence, I've noticed, are with the school kids. So when they were doing virtual school, there was a physical presence, but there was a psychological absence. And that psychological absence is, we're not doing school and we're not doing friendship. We're not doing interaction in the way that I hold it in my head or how I once knew it to be. So there was a psychological absence. And for a lot of people, I don't know about you, but I helped my niece during the virtual time. She's 7 years old. And it was quite interesting to see the whole classroom virtually. I mean, bless the teachers' hearts, I'll tell you. But most of the kids at 7, they're like there. And they're like this on the screen, and then they're over there watching TV, and you see the back of their head on the screen, okay? So there's no psychological presence there. And see, what's been really hard on the kids is they're not getting that sensory input they need for development and growing and learning. And that has posed a huge loss in our school systems and for our kids. Now, this is where I'm going to go back to the value system. We can say, but it was for a good thing. We had to keep them safe. I completely, 100% agree with you. But that does not take away that there was some sort of loss there. Does that make sense? We had a gain, and we had a loss that occurred at the same time. And when we go back to our old way of thinking in regards to fixing it, okay, we think about, well, if we just give it a reason why it occurred, then it will take the pain away from the loss. But that's not true. And that's why it's so important to use this language in working with people. So, I gotta make sure I get the right notes. The other phenomenon in type 2 that I noticed with ambiguous loss, with physical presence and psychological absence, everybody was working at home. And so there was no division of boundaries of we're working, we're together. And so we were all together in the same household. So we were physically present with one another, but we were psychologically absent because we were preoccupied. We had a harder time walking away from the computer or taking the call from work. Or by the time we took those calls from work and we arrived into our family system, we were so exhausted and shut down and stressed, we weren't engaging and talking with one another. And so I put that out there because I know that not all family households had it that great. Some had it great and some had it worse. So if family systems were already distressed and not able to function, and you throw a pandemic in there and they all have to be together, it even caused more stress in the households and more loss and ambiguity for everybody in it. So these, since the pandemic, and I think years of Pauline's work, she's kind of expanded ambiguous loss beyond just the family system. A lot of her work was around how ambiguity impacted and loss impacted the family system. And because they got so paralyzed in dealing with the stress, it actually collapsed the family system. But now she has expanded it to be thinking about personal ambiguous loss. And so when I use the word internally caused, I don't mean that you're to blame or someone is to blame. Excuse me, I have to open my water. The internal cause is losing the relationship we have with ourselves. So when you think about this, is more about the internal life, that internal dialogue we live with day to day with ourselves. Or if we have a physical illness, or say the anxiety has gotten so much for us in the last 2 years, or even the depression has gotten so much for us, or the stress has gotten so much for us, there's a part within ourselves we lose a sense of ourselves. I've even found that with people who've lost their jobs or lost their roles in their family systems, or even marriages that broke up because of the stress of the pandemic, okay? That they lost their sense of role, and when they lost that role, they lost a sense of themselves and how they related to themselves inside. A lot of the ambiguity is I no longer feel I am who I am, or I feel different. I'm physically different, I'm psychologically different, so my relationship to myself has changed, and in that change has created a loss. And then there's personal ambiguous loss that is externally caused. And this is where I believe stigmatization and marginalization, fill in the blank, okay, creates this ambiguity because I'm squeezed out of that role that I can no longer do because of some external circumstances. And due to COVID, there were many people who lost the status of their jobs, of their home ownership, and all sorts of things. And a lot of those things are those parts of ourselves that help us define who we are. And when we lose that status, then we lose that role, or we lose that sense of self, including that sense of mastery, that we actually can achieve things in our life. And then that creates a lot of ambiguity, which then creates a lot of loss. As well as there's ambiguous loss, and this is where I go to the collective, ambiguous loss at the societal and global levels. And that is, no matter what the issues are that we are dealing with or the problems we're dealing with, there's no immediate solutions in sight. And that no immediate solutions in sight is the ambiguity, or what generates the ambiguity, and what also generates the losses along the way. So on your first worksheet, I gave you guys a worksheet here, and I don't have it with me. Can I grab one off the table? Do you guys mind? There's another one. Thank you, sorry. The first worksheet here is I made a bunch of worksheets for you guys because I felt like it would be really helpful to take back to your work or whatever you do. Sometimes people need a worksheet just to be able to identify their losses. And so the first worksheet is ambiguous losses due to COVID-19 and clear losses due to COVID-19 with some ambiguity and uncertainty. And of course, this was a list that Pauline had put out, and I had copied and I forgot to reference that on here, but as well as I gave you room for people to just kind of define and look at their own losses. And be able to name it, and I think that is the key. So a couple of assumptions about ambiguous loss, and that is that the pathology lies in the external context of ambiguity, not the individual or family. And I think that's why it's really important for us to have this language, because it is the not knowing that is the stressor, not how someone is enduring it. And again, we often look at the person and hear how they are enduring it, and we're looking at the symptoms, and even themselves feels like there's something wrong with me. I should just be able to handle it. And what I'll say is like, no, there's nothing wrong with you. What you are experiencing is very congruent to the ambiguous loss that you are in. And sometimes just them hearing that and removing that stress so it's not so internalized gives them the space to process their grief and process their loss. Symptoms are often similar to complicated grief, but caused by social stress and not personal pathology. And this is where the myth of closure comes in. So as we approach people who are in a state of ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief, is that oftentimes we want to bring closure to them to get them out of pain. We don't want them to be in pain. They don't want to be in pain. But when we do that, we are actually causing more stress because their situation is not changing, because there's no end. So when the ambiguous loss is just continuing on and there's no finality or end, and we try to bring closure to it, we're trying to put a Band-Aid on an infected wound. And oftentimes that creates the stress and then forces people to internalize it and think that there's something wrong with them. The ambiguity, again, is the culprit. It creates the most stressful loss because it's incomprehensible and threatens health and our ability to be resilient. There is a degree of ambiguity in every loss, including death. And with a validated death, we have some certainty, proof that the loved one's transformation from life to death, thus our own transformation is possible. So in ordinary loss, even when we see someone move into death, even though that is clear, there's ambiguity around that, most especially around those deaths that don't make sense. And of course, suicide, murder, death of a child or baby, or any death that does not make sense, including the COVID deaths. I think there's a lot of ambiguity around that, a lot of feels unfair and unjust. And I think with that is to recognize that not only in our unfinal pieces, in our ambiguous loss, even in our ordinary loss where there is something that has ended, there's still some ambiguity around that. And I think for us, we want to bring it into closure. We figure if we bring some closure to somebody or bring meaning to close the chapter, that somehow that will help. Well, what we do is we close the space for people to really share and interact with their loss in a more healthy and resilient way. So, where do we begin? If we're not going to stop the bleed in people's pain as they process their ambiguous loss, where do we begin? And Pauline says that the best thing we can do is just name it and to normalize it. And what she says to people when she hears them talking is she says, what you are experiencing is ambiguous loss. She names it for them. It's the most difficult loss because it defies resolution. This is not your fault. The problem is ambiguity, not you. And it can be traumatizing. So with naming it, the work can begin for them. It gives them more space to process what they have lost and what it has meant to them. And then in time we bring them to the both and. And so how we begin being able to hold space for people is being able to look at how we deal with ambiguity in our own lives and how we do our ambiguous losses as well as our ambiguous grief. And the more endurance we learn within ourselves, I really do believe it empowers us to hold the space for other people in a stronger way. It gives more space for them to breathe into in a more resilient way in the ambiguity and in that loss. So closure is a myth. In fact, if Pauline had her druthers, she would like to remove that when we talk about loss and grief from our repertoire of words. She says, because what it does, it puts us on a path to fix it. And as I said before, I understand why we want to fix it. None of us likes pain, okay? It's hard. It's hard to see people in pain. And I think this is where our movement towards closure and fixing it came from, because we don't even like to see a little kid crying even though they want a cookie, right? You know, we're human beings. And so if we can grow our stamina or endurance, even, and I hate this word tolerance, our pain tolerance, our ability to withstand the discomfort of pain, I think we can really help people process more of their ambiguous losses and their ordinary losses and be able to grow and move on with their losses in a more functional way, including for ourselves.
Hey, Tanya.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I heard that correct, that she was suggesting we don't use the words
Yes.
grief and
No, to use the words grief and ambiguous loss, but not to use the word closure.
closure.
So when we're talking about losses, we don't want to use the word closure. And we want to be aware of, are we trying to fix it? And how are we fixing it? An example would be, I have a client who's experienced 5 miscarriages. And people will say, well, it was God's plan. Or, oh, but you have 2 children, okay? Those all come from our discomfort and our need to fix it. It's not that we're insensitive. It's just we've been conditioned to move ourselves and anybody away from pain. And when we move them away from their pain, we move them away from the loss. And when we move them away from the loss, we move them away from the person they're connected to. And that's why it doesn't work. Does that make sense? So, it's really interesting. When I first did this talk back in 2018, I used the example of the 2 types of loss. So if anything, what I'd love for you guys to walk away with is that ambiguous loss isn't this and that, okay? It's this fluid experience that can move into type 1 and type 2, okay? And I'll try to use an example. The first 11 years of my life, I lived with my parents, okay? And my father was an alcoholic. So he was physically present, but he was psychologically absent because of the alcoholism. And then at age 11, I moved into another ambiguous loss, and that is my parents separated and divorced. So there was a physical absence, but a psychological presence. Meaning that in my mind, and I'm 52 still, in my mind, I held the psychological picture of my family in my head, and it didn't match my reality. And still to this day, I hold that psychological picture of my mom and dad. It's like, even though I know that my parents will never get together again, you still hold that psychological picture of how you knew your family again, because it survives through memory. But with that generates an ambiguous loss. Does that make sense? So, yes, most of my adult life, I worked through that ambiguous loss. And part of that is learning to accept my father for who he was. I always had the hope that maybe he would do something about his alcoholism, but he never did. And so I could have stayed stuck, angry, and experiencing all those ambivalent emotions every time I see him. See, I'd go see him, and maybe I'd go see him, maybe I wouldn't, because he would always cancel because of alcohol, okay? But there's that constant state of loss that I had to figure out a new meaning. But if I stayed stuck in that uncertainty that my hope was never going to come to fruition, it paralyzed me, and I could never move away from that and the stress of that. And eventually, I got to the point where I could accept him for who he is, and if I saw him, great. If I didn't, it's okay. And then in February of 2020, I knew this day would come. My dad collapsed. Finally, alcohol got the best of him. I knew it was going to come. He was a chronic alcoholic, and in February of 2020, just before the pandemic, he collapsed and was diagnosed with liver cancer. Now, even though I resolved the ambiguity in childhood and into adulthood, I was entering into a whole new ambiguous loss. Now, for 5 months that I cared for him, and my sister and my stepmom cared for him, we got to experience my father for the first time with a sober mind. And it was the greatest gift. But now, you put the pandemic on top of that. How we navigated those 5 months, we lost the opportunity to hug. We lost the opportunity to give kisses, because that's what we did in our family system. We lost the opportunity to hold hands. We lost the opportunity of all of us being in the room with him to say goodbye because of the fear of the unknown. Now, at the time, it was reasonable. Okay, we were doing the best that we can. But now looking back and knowing those 5 months, that's all we had, it's like, oh my gosh, I lost the opportunity, I lost the time. Does that make sense? And so we still carry it and we still experience it. Even though we can reason it away, it's still a loss and it is still a grief. The other interesting thing was, as I moved into those 5 months,
would it be considered an ambiguous loss then? You experienced him with a sober mind. Was there ambiguous loss connected to kind of re-triggered all the years? Because
yes.
you
Yes.
didn't have a sober mind?
But it came in a different form. And the form was that he was physically present, and I'm thinking, oh, sober mind, this is good, we can connect, we can talk, all those things we wanted to talk to, right? But there was a psychological absence. Because there is a psychological absence in the dying. And this is the thing that I noticed. My dad was reconciling his ambiguity or his ambiguous loss internally. He now realized the loss of time. My dad was 69 years old, okay? When he had that sober mind, he then experienced everything he had lost and what alcohol had taken in his life. And now he could not see it or feel it until he was faced with death. that make sense? So here, my ambiguous loss is very different than his. But now reflecting back, I could see that that internal process that was happening psychologically took him out. And so then I had the psychological absence, but the physical presence there. Including that even when he did go into a coma, because we were lucky to be with him to his last breath, that there was a psychological absence. There's a part of death that we don't get to be a part of as we witness it. But it's still a loss for us. Does that make sense? And an ambiguity. It's an unknown. And I remember moments in those final days where the thing that I learned is that death is so near and yet so far. It's both and. And that was, I had to hold that ambiguity. I had to hold that contradiction. And even though it was painful to watch him go through it, and I wanted to end, I did want it to end at the same time. Is this helpful? So that's the fluidity that ambiguous loss can be. It moves in and out in different ways in our lives. So I want to talk a little bit about grief. Because grief is part of loss, even in ambiguous loss. Now, grief is not a feeling. So I want you to keep that in mind, and that will be on the next slide. But I love this, what Pauline Boss has wrote, grief. Like enduring a lesson that one is resisting. I learned with each loss that getting over it was not possible. I now walk with the tension of imperfect solutions and balance them with the joys and passion in my daily life. I intentionally hold the opposing ideas of absence and presence because I have learned that most relationships are indeed both. Have anybody heard of Stephen Jenkinson? He has done wonderful work in palliative care, most especially in Canada and in hospice. And he wrote a wonderful book called Die Wise. And this is one of my favorites in understanding grief. And like I said, grief is not a feeling, it's a skill. The crucible of making human beings is death. It is not success, it is not growth, it is not happiness. Death is the cradle of your love of life. Stephen says, grief is not a feeling, grief is a skill. And the twin of grief, as a skill of life, is the skill of being able to praise or love life, which means wherever you find one authentically done, the other is very close at hand. Grief and the praise of life side by side. And what I like about that is that it invites us to recognize that grief and how we do life is how we're going to do grief and loss. And I was meeting with a client this week, and she was describing all of her systems. She goes, I'm exhausted, and I just have no desire to do anything. I think my depression is back. And so I asked her a little bit more about, well, what's been going on? And it was disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. Everything she planned in the last month did not go as planned. And I said to her, it sounds like you've experienced a series of ambiguous losses. And it sounds like you're grieving. And she goes, huh? And I said, well, your fatigue makes sense. You've been having to endure change after change after change where you've had to adapt. And I said, to me, the fatigue seems very normal. No wonder why you're exhausted. You've been in a constant state of problem solving, okay? And with that, you've been in a constant state of grief too. Because what you once knew, you no longer knew. And you had to adapt and change. And that takes energy. And that is stressful. And there was some, by the end of the session, just normalizing it and giving her that energy to be thinking about what she's experiencing is loss, and there's a part of it that is grief. And she says, but it's so hard. And I said, I know it's hard. I said, grief is hard. Learning how to do grief as a skill is hard. Learning how to do life is hard. And I said, but you're doing the hard. And you're not alone in it. So, I also gave some information here in regards to being able to differentiate depression and grief, which I'm not really gonna spend much time on, but I wanted to give you guys that information with that. Because oftentimes the symptoms of depression look like the symptoms of grief, or what the person is experiencing in that ambiguous loss. And I'd like to just have an idea of it, not to minimize one's depression. I think when we feel sad, we use the word depressed. But it kind of helps us to be able to see and help people sort out too, whether they're grieving and both experiencing depression. Does anybody have any questions? So we cannot get rid of the ambiguity, but we can increase our tolerance of ambiguity. And I don't know why tolerance hits me wrong, but it does, and that's kind of my own issue. I like the word endurance. We need to increase our endurance with the unknown. And that's what I really try to teach my clients, and how I do that is I also give them the word resiliency. So we all have a self-writing part within us. Oh, yeah.
I think tolerance implies it's a negative thing, and that's why you don't like it. Because embracing the grief as a positive thing fits better with the philosophy of Pauline Boss.
I agree with you. I think I don't want the negativity to be in this endurance, or our resiliency can be a positive thing even though the loss is negative. Yes, I agree. So there it is. Thank you. Resiliency is not just bouncing back. It's about regaining one's energy to endure the adversity or the uncertainty that we're facing. I do believe, if given time and space, and this is why I think fixing it or bringing closure to someone's situation too soon or at all really shuts down people's ability to find their own resiliency inside. And sometimes what I'll say to them is that, you know what, just as much as loss and grief is a part of our life, we also have these resources internally, which is called resiliency. I mean, that is naturally born in us. And sometimes we get overwhelmed by the stress and the ambivalent emotions we don't even feel or think about, oh, you know what, I can do this. I can get through it even though it's not what I want or not what I want to do. I know that I can endure this. There's something in me that is designed to help me. So, part of encouraging resiliency is to allow the space within the individual and family to adapt. Again, it's about increasing our ability or endurance to sit in someone with them in their pain or in their darkness. Even when, and I noticed that this week, I had a client that was trying to create meaning from why she's such in pain, okay? So she extrapolated back to the past, and even though she was extrapolating, trying to figure out, this is my fault for my suffering, okay? And I knew it was wrong. I had to let her go there because she was processing it, because eventually I'd want to bring her back to the both and, okay? Which is, the both and, so one way to increase one's resiliency is to help them hold the both and thinking. So this is called dialectical thinking, holding two opposing ideas and beliefs. So in someone in their ambiguous laws, the missing person is both gone and still present in that psychological picture of their mind, okay? She is both gone and still here, someone with Alzheimer's. You know, they're physically present but psychologically gone. It's not either or. And when we're under stress, our brains will go to more either or binary thinking and move away from the both and thinking. So even as I was allowing my client to go down that track, on one side of the track she was trying to create meaning from why she had so much suffering in her now. She was trying to find the cause, okay? Which is what we do to make the pain go away, thinking it's going to change the pain. But I had to let her go and eventually in conversation bring her to the both and. Meaning it's a possibility and not a possibility at the same time, you know? And so both and thinking and being able to give the space for people to learn how to do the both and. And sometimes when I bring the both and in too soon, they're like, oh no. They hang on even further to that, no, you're not letting me leave my pain and my reasons for it, okay? So they will hang on to it and it's very hard. So I say the both and thinking is a very gentle process. And you move them, you just keep it in mind for yourself, but you really try to move them when they're ready to move. And this comes to the tolerance of sitting in the discomfort of that pain, or the tolerance of sitting in the discomfort of that ambiguity. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
To help me with an example, like in the case of, let's say, a severed friendship during the pandemic, like would examples of not both and thinking be like, I'm going after this person like every day, trying to renew the friendship and figure out what the issue is and like get back to a healthy place, versus I'm moving on, I've gotten over this person, I'm never talking to him again. Like both and would be somewhere in between of like, there's maybe hope for the future, but things aren't good right now.
That, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're comparing is the actions you take to repair the relationship, which can be a both and. But it's more about how you hold the loss inside of you. That there's a physical absence and a psychological presence, that you still hold that friendship in your mind and in your heart as having value. But there's an absence out here, and still an uncertainty of whether that can repair or not. So it's holding the both and, that he or she is here and not here at the same time. And as well as that, so does that answer the question?
Yeah.
The both and, it's more around the both and around the loss that you hold. But there can be a both and as well as in the action of repair and resolution. That both of those resolutions, whether I let that relationship go or I try to repair it, it's a both and option in that repair. Did I answer your question? So it's more around how you hold the loss and how you experience the loss internally. And sometimes I say it's too soon to tell. You know, there were a lot of relationships that severed in our families over the last 2 years and in our friendships. And this is what I say, it's too early to tell if they can repair or not. But in the meantime, we hope we stay in that state of unknown. And then we stay in that state of loss. I still have the psychological picture of that friendship, and in my heart I still hold that person, but there's a physical absence.
Could you give maybe like one more example of that kind of both and, what that would look like internally?
Yeah.
Maybe an example also would be when you lose somebody to death and you have your heart broken. And at the same time, you're grateful that they are in a better place, that they are free of pain and free of suffering. And people will say, well, you should be grateful. You should be grateful that they're gone.
But you're
both
still
are
hurting.
true.
Yes.
I am heartbroken and the loss is immense, and at the same time, I am grateful. And so you don't want to get stuck in either place without either of those. That would be one
Right.
different kind of example.
Yeah. The both and is kind of designed for us to be in the fullness of our reality. I mean, even in that example with my father, you know, I wanted him to stay. I was heartbroken that he was dying. And at the same time, I was grateful that he was finally out of pain. Not just the pain in dying, but the pain of suffering with chronic alcoholism most of his life. So it's definitely that both and, that you hold that loss in. I want him back, and I don't want him back, because if he's back, then he's in pain. Does that make sense? So it's the both and. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a hard one, because our brains are designed to find meaning in comparison, which is the either or thinking. And that's kind of what gets us stuck. And then either or thinking is going to get us stuck. And I'm watching the time here, that these are some of the transformation movements that we have to kind of go through. Let's see if I can get to a better slide. And that is, these are the guidelines for transforming us from ambiguous loss. And in each one of these, finding meaning, adjusting mastery, reconstructing identity, normalizing ambivalence, meaning contradictory emotions, revising attachments, and discovering new hope, redefining hope. Now, this is not like a perfect circle. It's just presented to you that way. People are moving in and out of these parts in their ambiguous loss, and my suggestion and my advice to you is to bring the both and thinking in this process. So even as people are processing their meaning, you know, around ambiguous loss, that we have to bring the both and, okay? Even ordinary loss as well. And so I kind of want to go to the worksheets and any questions. We have just like about 5 or 6 minutes left. I gave you the worksheet, but the first sheet is supposed to really just help you to start the conversation and helping people identify loss, okay? And I really think here you can get really specific. You know, I lost my ability to brush my teeth, okay? It's a loss. And I know it seems like, oh, well, that's really superficial or something, but it might have a lot of meaning. We don't know what meaning is assigned behind people's losses, and that's where we first have to start identifying what they identify as their losses to be, and then ask them, what does it mean to them? So if you skip over the psychological family, I'll let you go there, but if you go into this chart here, I try to make this for you guys to help you with whoever you would like yourselves, or with people you sit with. And that is, it's a chart for people to list their ambiguous losses and their clear losses, which is more their, you know, ordinary final losses. And then also to write down, what does this mean to me? So whatever that loss is, then asking, what does this mean to me? What meaning did you assign to the loss when it occurred? And think about, and sometimes what I'll say to them is think about what were the expectations you had, and then what did happen, if that makes sense. And this just begins them starting the process of finding their resiliency, and also gives you the opportunity to move them into the both and, which is more real for them. Because it's true, whether it's an ordinary loss or an ambiguous loss, both and coexist. I'm grateful that my father is out of pain, okay, but I'm heartbroken and grieving his loss that he's not in my life. And he's now gone. Does that make sense? So, another thing that I want to, so there's a worksheet on that. Let's go back to the psychological family. This is another tool. That when people are feeling very overwhelmed by the stress of uncertainty in their life, burdened out by all the losses, that even people who've lost family members, either family members by ordinary loss, or even family members because relationships just have severed because of the stress the last 2 years, that another technique that we can use is called the psychological family. And that is, in your imagination, draw the people that you hold inside of you that bring you support. Okay? And I think this is a good one for kids because they love pictures, right? They're very visual learners. And so this helps them to who is in that circle that you hold in your imagination that helps you through crisis and uncertainty. And this, it could include pets, a deity, friends, people you've never met before, whoever. You get to use your creativity here. And sometimes just them drawing them out, they can access that feeling of that person inside of them to help them kind of ride out the stress of ambiguity and loss. So, does that make sense? Like I said, I have more information here, and I hope the slides are very helpful. And we are fresh into many ambiguous losses right now, and the first step we do is just start naming it and help people find meaning in the both and thinking. Any questions? Thank you, guys. Questions?
Just wanna, like,
Yeah.
the meeting thing, I take it a little bit in a different direction at some point in terms of, you know, it doesn't mean anything, you give it all the meaning you have,
Yes.
you know, based on those past experiences. And at some point, what is the meaning that you have telling you about what you believe?
Right.
About loss, about
Yes.
yourself, about you in the loss.
Yeah.
And working to kind of come to that neutral place.
Yes.
Even to get to the both end.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. In the process of discovering meaning in our loss, there's always a facet. It's multidimensional. There's always a facet where we are self-identifying ourselves through that loss. Or even what does it mean about me, or what does it mean about my relationships, or what does this mean about me and my relationships in the future? So there's always that component. I think that's what you're saying, right, Terry? Yeah. So meaning is multi-layered. So even if they give you a meaning, go again. Well, if that's true, then what? And you'll find more and more, you'll be digging up more and more meaning. Okay? So yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. You guys have been a wonderful people. It's just great to be in the presence of bodies and seeing you guys and seeing faces. So thank you so much for coming and spending time with us. And we hope to see you April 1st. I believe our topic, Cheryl Schultz and her daughter, Keely, are talking about cultivating, unless, could you remind me?
Cultivating a beautiful God image.
Yes, cultivating a beautiful God image, and that will be on April 1st, and I hope that you guys can join us. So thank you very much.